Hey guys, tonight we take a long, scenic trip back to 1915, to a sunny little corner of the world called the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, don't let the pleasant name fool you. This is about to be a complete dumpster fire of military planning. It's the First World War and Europe has been locked in a miserable trench stalemate for months. The British and French are desperate to break the deadlock, and someone, probably after too much tea and not enough sleep, says, hey, what if we just go around Germany? This is where the Ottomans come in. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty and now creaky like an old chair, is Germany's ally. The Allies figure, if we kick the Ottoman legs out from under Germany, maybe the whole table collapses. And by kick, they mean invade. Their brilliant plan? Take control of the Dardanelles Strait, sail right to Istanbul, then called Constantinople, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. Simple, right? Like grabbing the last slice of pizza at a party. Except, well, the Ottomans aren't just going to roll over and hand them the keys. Plus, the Dardanelles is basically a narrow death funnel lined with forts, mines, and artillery. It's like trying to run through a hallway filled with people throwing bricks at your head. The Allies, undeterred, think, but we have battleships, because obviously floating hunks of metal will solve all problems. And here's where things start getting funny if you're into dark comedy. The initial naval assault in March 1915 goes terribly. The Allies steam in with their shiny ships only to get blown to bits by Ottoman gunners who, to everyone's surprise, actually know how to aim. Several battleships sink, others are crippled, and the British admiral sighs deeply, realizing this was not the power move he imagined. It's like showing up to a fist fight with a sword and realizing the other guy has a cannon. So, Plan A, smash through with the Navy, fails spectacularly. Enter Plan B, land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, capture the high ground, and then bring in the ships. This plan comes from none other than Winston Churchill, who at this point is First Lord of the Admiralty. Young, brash, and absolutely convinced he's a military genius, Churchill pushes the idea hard. Spoiler alert, this is going to haunt his career for years. Imagine proposing a group project and then watching it burn down while everyone stares at you. At this point, the Allies start rounding up troops from all over their empire. British regulars, French colonial forces, and, notably, soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the ANZACs. These poor guys are told they're off to a grand adventure, like a vacation with rifles. Many of them probably pictured Paris cafes or maybe a nice beach in the Mediterranean. Instead, they get Gallipoli, which is basically a rocky death trap filled with cliffs, scrub, and very determined Ottoman defenders. The scale of this operation is massive. Over 400,000 Allied troops will eventually rotate through, facing around 300,000 Ottomans under the command of capable generals like Liman von Sanders and a certain rising star named Mustafa Kemal. And the casualties? Absolutely staggering. By the end, roughly 500,000 people will be dead, wounded, or missing. This was supposed to be a quick knockout punch. Instead, it will turn into a 9-month grind of mud, blood, and very bad decision-making. Now, let's talk about why this battle has an odd layer of comedy. Picture this: multiple armies speaking different languages, officers who barely know the terrain, and supply chains that make a modern DMV look efficient. There are moments where orders get so garbled that entire units charge in the wrong direction, or into the sea. One French officer later remarked that Gallipoli was less like a battle and more like a very deadly circus. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, did you know about this battle before? If not, drop a comment after you hear how it really went down. Ready? Let's drop into tonight's story. Things are about to get weird. The stage is set in early 1915. The Allies, having licked their wounds from the failed naval assault, now turn to amphibious warfare. Their plan is ambitious: simultaneous landings at multiple beaches along the peninsula. British and French forces will hit the southern tip at Cape Helles, while the ANZAC strike further north at what they'll come to call ANZAC Cove. A third landing will serve as a diversion, because nothing says good strategy like throwing soldiers somewhere just to confuse the enemy. Here's a historical fact for you. This will be one of the very first major amphibious operations of the modern era. Today, military planners study Gallipoli as a case study in what not to do. The Allies have almost no experience coordinating massive landings, and it shows. The maps are inaccurate, the intelligence outdated, and the officers overly confident. One British general famously dismissed concerns by saying, "The Turks will be too busy running away to shoot straight." As you might guess, this will age poorly. Meanwhile, on the Ottoman side, morale is sky high. They're defending their homeland, and they have the advantage of high ground and prepared defenses. Plus, their German advisors are experienced and meticulous. The Ottomans lay mines, dig trenches, and set up machine gun nests like they're decorating for the most violent housewarming party ever. And then there's Mustafa Kemal, a relatively unknown officer at this point. He has a knack for being in the right place at the right time and making bold decisions. When the landings begin, he will famously rally his troops with the line, "I am not ordering you." By mid-April, the Allied fleet is gathering off the coast, crammed with soldiers who are equal parts nervous and seasick. Supplies are piled high, officers are pacing, and somewhere in the distance, Ottoman sentries are watching through binoculars, probably muttering, "Well, here they come." The die is cast, and the Gallipoli campaign is about to begin in earnest. But even before the first boot hits the beach, problems are already brewing. Communication between the British and French commands is, let's call it, strained. The ANZACs, full of enthusiasm, aren't entirely sure where they're landing. And the weather? Windy, rough seas, and just generally uncooperative. It's as if nature itself is trying to tell everyone, "Bad idea, folks." On April 24th, final orders are given. The soldiers load into small boats, their rifles oiled and ready. Some write last-minute letters home, others clutch Lucky Charms. A few probably wonder if maybe enlisting wasn't the best life choice. By dawn on April 25th, the invasion will begin. A chaotic storm of bullets, bravery, and blunders that will shape the course of the campaign. The morning of April 25th, 1915 dawns gray and tense. Hundreds of small boats rock gently on the dark waves, crammed with soldiers who have spent the night trying not to think too hard about what's coming. For many, this is their first taste of combat, and it smells like wet wool, salt water, and pure dread. The Allied commanders have carefully divided the landings into different sectors with code names that sound deceptively cheerful. V Beach, W Beach, X Beach, and so on. It's like they're labeling picnic spots instead of war zones. The Gallipoli Peninsula itself is, frankly, a nightmare. Picture rugged cliffs, narrow beaches, and scrub-covered hills that rise sharply from the shoreline. It's as if someone designed a landscape specifically to ruin the day of anyone trying to invade it. The Ottomans, of course, are dug in at the top of these heights, their machine guns and rifles perfectly positioned to turn any landing into a massacre. It's like charging uphill into a hornet's nest, except the hornets have artillery. The British plan sounds good on paper. Land, secure the beaches, push inland, and link up across the peninsula. But here's the catch. Almost nothing goes according to plan in war, and Gallipoli will prove that in spades. The first wave of troops, mostly British and French, begin rowing toward shore before dawn. They row in silence, hearts pounding, the only sounds being the creak of oars and the occasional muffled curse when someone smacks a neighbor in the face by accident. At Cape Helles, one of the main landing points, things get off to a spectacularly bad start. V Beach is supposed to be a relatively easy landing zone, but when the boats get close, the soldiers discover the Ottomans are very much awake and very much ready. Machine guns open waves of men. The water turns red and boats capsize under the weight of panicked soldiers trying to escape. A converted coal ship called the River Clyde has been outfitted to carry over 2,000 troops directly onto the beach. Instead of a smooth landing, it crashes into hidden obstacles and comes under heavy fire, trapping men inside like sardines in a very loud, very deadly can. One British officer surveying the scene is rumored to mutter, "Well, that could have gone better." Which might be the understatement of the century. By midday, V Beach is a slaughterhouse, and the Allied advance there has stalled before it even begins. Meanwhile, the French are having their own little slice of chaos. Tasked with launching a diversionary assault at Calais on the Asian side of the strait, they fight bravely, but quickly realize their mission is basically to keep Ottoman forces busy while everyone else gets pummeled. One French soldier reportedly jokes, "At least the wine back home doesn't shoot at us," which earns him a laugh and probably a reprimand. Up the coast, the ANZAC forces, Australians and New Zealanders who have been hyped up as fierce and ready for action, are about to experience their own disaster. They were supposed to land on a relatively flat beach with decent cover. Instead, thanks to poor navigation and strong currents, they drift about a mile north and hit a completely different spot. A tiny, narrow cove surrounded by steep cliffs. Surprise! It's like booking a vacation to Hawaii and ending up in a haunted swamp. As dawn breaks, the ANZAC boats hit the shore and immediately come under withering fire. Men leap into the water, some drowning under the weight of their gear, others scrambling desperately for cover. The Ottoman defenders, perched high above, rain bullets and grenades down like angry gods. It's pure chaos. Despite the slaughter, the ANZACs fight tooth and nail to establish a foothold, scrambling up cliffs with rifles slung over their shoulders. One soldier later recalls, "It wasn't a beach, it was a nightmare with sand." Historical fact check! By the end of that first day, the ANZACs will suffer over 2,000 casualties. The Ottomans will lose nearly as many thanks to the ferocity of the fighting. This is not a gentle introduction to war, it's a brutal initiation ceremony. Here's a weird bit of trivia. One ANZAC soldier reportedly brought a boomerang with him, claiming it was his lucky charm. Whether he actually intended to throw it at the enemy is unclear. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine artifact or just a story passed down to highlight the sometimes absurd mix of cultures on the battlefield. Back to the British landings. At W Beach, also known as Lancashire Landing, the troops face similar challenges but manage to secure a small beachhead after hours of vicious fighting. The sand is littered with bodies, spent cartridges, and abandoned gear. Medical personnel scramble to treat the wounded, often under fire themselves. There are no clean lines, no neat formations, just a sprawling mess of men trying to survive while officers yell conflicting orders. One British general, watching the carnage through binoculars, reportedly says, "We'll be in Constantinople by tea." Whether this was meant as sarcasm or delusion is anyone's guess. Spoiler, they will not be in Constantinople by tea, or by dinner, or ever. By nightfall, the situation across Gallipoli is grim. The Allies have managed to cling to a few small patches of beach, but at staggering cost. Supplies are already running low. Communications are in shambles, and reinforcements are arriving too slowly to make a real difference. The Ottomans, on the other hand, are emboldened. Their commanders see the disorganized landings and realize they have a golden opportunity to crush the invaders before they can dig in. This is where Mustafa Kemal enters the story in a big way. Upon hearing reports of the ANZAC landing, he rushes to the front lines. In one of the most famous moments of the campaign, he stops retreating Ottoman troops and delivers his legendary order. "I am not ordering you to fight, I am ordering you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other forces can come and take our place." It's grim, but it works. The Ottomans rally and launch fierce counterattacks throughout the night, preventing the ANZACs from advancing further inland. Historians still argue whether the landing at Gallipoli could have succeeded if the Allies had been better prepared. Some say it was doomed from the start due to geography and logistics. Others believe that with tighter coordination and accurate maps, the peninsula might have been taken. Either way, the reality on the ground is that thousands of men are now stuck on narrow beaches with nowhere to go but forward, or back into the sea. As the first day of the campaign ends, exhausted soldiers huddle in shallow trenches, listening to the cries of the wounded and the distant boom of Ottoman artillery. Somewhere, a junior officer probably wonders aloud, whose idea was this anyway? The answer, of course, is complicated. But one thing is certain, Gallipoli is now a nightmare that no one can easily escape. April 25th, 1915, ANZAC Day. Goes down as one of the most chaotic, courageous, and downright baffling days of the entire campaign. The Australians and New Zealanders, soaked to the bone and half deaf from the constant gunfire, have barely clung to a strip of rocky beach by the time the sun rises. This tiny stretch of shoreline, with steep ridges looming above, will soon earn the simple name ANZAC Cove. At first, it sounds like a postcard destination. Later, everyone will agree it's more like the entrance to an especially unpleasant circle of hell. The geography here is merciless. The ANZACs are stuck in what amounts to a natch below is exposed to rifle and machine gun fire. It's like trying to play hide and seek in an empty parking lot while someone throws grenades at you. The ANZAC commanders, realizing they've landed in the wrong spot but unable to fix it now, make the only call they can: dig in and pray for reinforcements. From the start, communication is a disaster. Units get split up, messages are garbled, and no one is entirely sure where anyone else is. One runner reportedly returns to headquarters 3 times with the same message because his commander keeps forgetting he sent it. In another case, an order to advance cautiously somehow gets translated into charge immediately, leading to a sudden and entirely unnecessary uphill sprint that ends in predictable disaster. Still, the ANZACs fight with remarkable grit. Accounts from the day describe small groups of soldiers clawing their way up steep slopes, bayonets fixed, under relentless fire. They seize a ridge here, a trench there, only to be pushed back by counterattacks. One Australian sergeant, when asked why his men kept charging despite impossible odds, supposedly replied, "Because running back to the beach means swimming home." The Ottomans, for their part, are equally determined. Mustafa Kemal proves to be a hands-on leader, personally visiting frontline positions and encouraging his troops. He quickly earns the respect of his men and the grudging admiration of his enemies. His ability to improvise under pressure becomes legendary. In one instance, when his men run low on ammunition, he reportedly orders them to fix bayonets and lie flat. The sight of a silent, motionless line of troops unnerves the ANZACs long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Whether this story is entirely true or slightly embellished by later retellings remains a subject of debate among historians. As the day grinds on, both sides realize they are locked in a grim stalemate. The ANZACs can't push inland, and the Ottomans can't quite drive them back into the sea. The beach itself becomes a bizarre mix of battlefield and camp. Dead bodies, shattered boats, and piles of supplies are strewn across the sand. A temporary field hospital is set up under constant sniper fire, with doctors performing surgeries while bullets whistle overhead. Here's a strange bit of trivia. During those first days, some ANZAC soldiers take to naming the Ottoman snipers they can't seem to hit. One particularly elusive sharpshooter is nicknamed Abdul the Terrible. Supposedly, he survives for weeks, harassing the beachhead day and night, before finally disappearing without a trace. Some veterans later claim he escaped and lived out his days as a farmer, while others insist he was just a myth invented to pass the time between battles. Meanwhile, back at Cape Helles, the British are making painfully slow progress. The landings there have turned into brutal slugging matches, With each inch of ground paid, officers begin to realize they've underestimated the Ottomans badly. The assumption that Turkish troops would break and run has proven disastrously wrong. In fact, their morale only seems to increase with each failed Allied assault. The French, who are still holding the diversionary position across the strait, send increasingly testy messages to British headquarters. Diversionary has turned into suicidal, and they'd very much like to stop now, thank you. Coordination between the Allied forces remains poor. French and British officers sometimes meet to discuss plans, only to discover they've been attacking completely different objectives without telling each other. It's like watching two rival sports teams accidentally play on the same field. By the evening of April 25th, exhaustion is setting in everywhere. The ANZACs, who started the day with high hopes, are now simply trying to survive the night. Trenches are hastily dug, often so shallow that soldiers can't even lie down fully. Supplies are scarce. Fresh water in particular becomes a desperate concern. Some men resort to drinking from puddles, only to discover they've swallowed more mud than hydration. And then there are the flies. The combination of heat, unburied bodies, and open latrines turns Gallipoli into a paradise for buzzing insects. Within days, swarms of flies descend on every surface. Soldiers joke bitterly that the flies seem better fed than they are. One diary entry notes, "I opened my mouth to shout and a fly beat me to it." It's equal parts disgusting and darkly comedic. The night of April 25th brings a new kind of horror, confusion in the dark. Both sides launch probing attacks, leading to chaotic hand-to-hand skirmishes where no one can tell friend from foe. In the pitch black, a soldier's worst enemy is often panic. One famous incident involves a group of ANZACs who, convinced they've stumbled onto Ottoman troops, open fire, only to discover they've been shooting at their own unit the entire time. The survivors later refer to it grimly as the battle we won against ourselves. Despite the bloodshed, there are moments of strange humanity. During brief lulls in the fighting, soldiers on both sides sometimes exchange insults, or even small gifts. Cigarettes, food, and notes are tossed across the lines. One Australian reportedly sent over a tin of jam labeled "To Abdul, with love." In return, he received a packet of Turkish tobacco and a note reading, "Much obliged, mate." As dawn breaks on April 26th, the reality of the situation sets in. The Allies have failed to achieve any of their main objectives. They hold only tiny enclaves, barely connected and constantly under threat. Casualties are staggering. Entire battalions have been wiped out. Commanders argue over what to do next, with some urging immediate withdrawal and others insisting on pushing forward. Historian campaign could have been salvaged. Some argue that a rapid, aggressive push inland might have caught the Ottomans off guard. Others believe the opportunity was already lost, and that every additional day spent on the peninsula only deepened the disaster. On the beaches, the men have no time for grand strategy debates. They are too busy fortifying their positions and tending to the wounded. The smell of smoke, sweat, and decay hangs heavy in the air. Somewhere, a soldier scribbles in his diary, "If this is victory, I'd hate to see defeat." By the end of that first week, the Gallipoli campaign has already shifted from a daring gamble to a grinding siege. The ANZACs, the British, and the French are trapped, and the Ottomans have no intention of letting them leave. The stage is now set for a long, bitter struggle that will test the limits of endurance on both sides. While the ANZACs cling desperately to their rocky beachhead, a few miles south, the French are gearing up for their own performance on the chaotic stage of Gallipoli. Their assigned task sounds straightforward on paper. Launch a landing at Calais, across the Dardanelles on the Asian side, to distract Ottoman forces and keep them from reinforcing the main defenses at Cape Helles. It's the military equivalent of shouting, "Hey, look over there," while someone else tries to sneak past. The French troops are a diverse mix, including not only metropolitan French units, but also colonial soldiers from North Africa. Algerians, Tunisians, Senegalese, all thrown together and told to cooperate seamlessly in the middle of a war zone. The language barriers alone make planning difficult. One officer later quipped that giving an order was like sending a letter in a bottle and hoping it reached the right person. As the landing craft pushed toward the shore, Ottoman artillery opens up, and the beach instantly becomes a maelstrom of explosions and flying sand. The French, determined but under heavy fire, charge forward with remarkable bravery. Some units even manage to seize a few enemy trenches. For about 12 glorious minutes, things actually look promising. Then the Ottomans counterattack with brutal efficiency, and the French suddenly realize they're horribly outnumbered and exposed. One French captain, watching the chaos unfold, is overheard shouting, "C'est ridicule," which loosely translates to "this is ridiculous," though historians suspect he might have used slightly stronger language in the heat of battle. The fighting at Calais rages for 2 days. The French achieve their objective, drawing Ottoman troops away from the main front, but at a staggering cost. Casualties mount quickly, and the operation becomes less about tactical success and more about sheer survival. By the end, the French forces are withdrawn, battered but intact. Their sacrifice buys the Allies precious time, but also foreshadows the grim attrition to come. Meanwhile, back at Cape Helles, the British are engaged in some of the most intense fighting of the campaign. V Beach, which was already a nightmare on day one, continues to be a slaughterhouse. W and X beaches fare slightly better, but only slightly. Every inch of progress is paid for with blood. Officers are beginning to realize that taking Gallipoli will require far more than they originally planned. More men, more supplies, and definitely more luck. Here's a verified historical fact. One of the most famous British units at Gallipoli was the Lancashire Fusiliers, who landed at W Beach. They faced such heavy fire that 6 members of the regiment were awarded the Victoria Cross, the British Empire's highest military honor for their actions that day. It was later described as 6 VCs before breakfast, which sounds heroic, but also highlights just how brutally costly the landing was. Despite these small victories, the overall situation remains dire. The Allies are struggling to coordinate their efforts. The British and French commands don't always see eye to eye, and misunderstandings abound. At one meeting, a French general allegedly spent half an hour passionately arguing for a plan, only for his British counterpart to nod politely and then announce, "Splendid idea, old chap. Now let's do the exact opposite." On the Ottoman side, morale is soaring. Mustafa Kemal's leadership is proving decisive. His ability to anticipate enemy moves and deploy reinforcements at critical moments keeps the Allies constantly off balance. Ottoman soldiers, inspired by both patriotism and Kemal's fiery speeches, fight with unyielding determination. Many are defending their own villages and homes, giving them a personal stake in the battle that the invading troops can't match. And then there's the geography, always working against the Allies. The Gallipoli Peninsula is a nightmare of steep ridges, narrow gullies, and dense scrub. Moving supplies or reinforcements is a logistical headache of epic proportions. Even simple tasks like carrying water to the front lines become Herculean efforts. Horses and mules struggle on the rocky terrain, and men often end up hauling equipment by hand. Here's a weird bit of trivia. At one point, the Allies attempt to use donkeys to transport supplies up the cliffs. The animals, understandably terrified by the noise and chaos, often bolt or simply refuse to move. One frustrated soldier reportedly tried to give a donkey a motivational speech, shouting, "Come on, old boy, do it for king and country!" The donkey, unsurprisingly, remained unmoved. By early May, both sides are settling into a grim routine. The initial landings have failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, and now the campaign is shifting toward trench warfare. The Allies dig in along the beaches, while the Ottomans fortify the high ground. The result is a stalemate eerily similar to the Western Front, complete with barbed wire, machine guns, and endless mud. only this time with added heat and swarms of flies. At this point, the French launch another major assault, this time alongside the British at Cape Helles. The plan is simple: overwhelm the Ottoman defenses with sheer numbers. As always, reality has other ideas. The attack quickly devolves into chaos. Poor communication leads to units advancing at different times, creating gaps in the line. Ottoman machine gunners exploit these openings with devastating effect. One French officer later described the scene. Men charged forward bravely, only to be cut down like wheat before the scythe. We advanced. We fell back. We advanced again. It was less a battle and more a dance of death. Despite the heavy losses, the Allies managed to capture a few key positions. These minor gains come at a staggering price, however. The French, in particular, are hit hard. Their colonial troops suffer disproportionately, often thrown into the most dangerous sectors with little support. Letters from these soldiers reveal a mix of pride and bitterness. Pride in their courage, bitterness at being treated as expendable. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these early assaults. Some argue that the Allies came tantalizingly close to breaking through, only to falter due to poor coordination and lack of reserves. Others believe the Ottoman defenses were simply too strong, and that no amount of bravery could have overcome them. As May drags on, both sides dig in deeper. The beaches are now cluttered with makeshift defenses, supply dumps, and endless lines of trenches. Soldiers begin to give names to different landmarks: Shrapnel Valley, Plugs Plateau, Dead Man's Ridge. These names are darkly humorous, a way to make sense of the horror around them. In the midst of this, occasional moments of bizarre normalcy occur. One evening, during a lull in the fighting, a French unit begins singing a popular song. To their surprise, Ottoman soldiers on the other side join in with their own tune. For a brief, surreal moment, the battlefield is filled with music instead of gunfire. Then, as quickly as it began, the spell is broken and the killing resumes. By the end of May, the Gallipoli campaign has entered a new phase. The initial shock of the landings has worn off, replaced by a grinding war of attrition. Both sides are preparing for the long haul, digging deeper trenches, stockpiling ammunition, and steeling themselves for the brutal summer ahead. The Allies are no closer to their ultimate goal, and the Ottomans, far from being on the verge of collapse, are growing stronger by the day. The stage is now set for a drawn-out struggle that will test the endurance, ingenuity, and sanity of everyone involved. And as always at Gallipoli, just when things seem like they can't get worse, they do. While the British and French are busy bleeding and arguing at Cape Helles, the Ottoman forces are quietly doing something this campaign. They're getting their act together. Up until now, the Allies had been confident that their modern navy, larger numbers, and superior industrial resources would eventually crush the Ottomans. What they hadn't counted on was a charismatic young officer named Mustafa Kemal, who was about to turn the Gallipoli campaign into his personal stage. Kemal, a colonel at this point, has been zipping up and down the peninsula like a caffeinated messenger pigeon. He has a gift for knowing exactly where the crisis points are and showing up just in time to save the day. His men adore him, not because he's warm and cuddly, but because he's brutally honest. Where other commanders might give vague pep talks, Kemal delivers the verbal equivalent of a slap across the face. In one famous moment, when a group of retreating Ottoman soldiers nearly runs him over, he halts them with a single line that will echo through history. "I am not ordering you to fight. I am ordering you to die." It's a horrifying thing to say, but also strangely inspiring. The message is clear: hold this ground at all costs, and by sacrificing yourselves, you will give others time to win. The men, rather than collapsing into despair, dig in and fight like demons. Centuries later, Turkish school children will memorize this quote, though probably without the accompanying thought, "Wow, this guy was intense." As Ottoman forces rally under Kemal's leadership, their defenses solidify. Trenches appear seemingly overnight. Artillery is dragged into position by sheer manpower, as there are almost no working vehicles in the rugged terrain. Machine guns are placed so cleverly that Allied troops later describe certain approaches as suicide lanes. The Ottomans may be short on supplies and modern equipment, but they more than make up for it with cunning and sheer stubbornness. Here's a confirmed historical fact. The Ottoman defenders at Gallipoli were a mix of seasoned regulars and barely trained conscripts. Some were so new to soldiering that they didn't even have proper uniforms. Despite this, they fought fiercely, proving that morale and leadership can often outweigh shiny equipment. The Allies, meanwhile, are falling apart at the seams. Logistics are a nightmare. Food spoils in the heat. Clean water is scarce, and medical facilities are overwhelmed. British command insists on maintaining strict Victorian-era discipline, which leads to absurd situations. For instance, at one point, an order is issued that officers must continue wearing full dress uniforms, including starched collars and polished boots, while directing battles in sweltering 90-degree heat. Unsurprisingly, this does not improve morale. One soldier reportedly quipped, "We'll die of sunstroke before the Turks shoot us." At the ANZAC positions, things aren't much better. The Australians and New Zealanders have proven themselves fierce fighters, but they're stuck in a terrible position. The cliffs and ridges above ANZAC Cove are honeycombed with Ottoman positions. Every attempt to advance results in horrific casualties. The only way to survive is to dig fast and deep. Soon, the entire area resembles a bizarre ant farm. Trenches twist and turn in every direction, some so close to enemy lines that soldiers can hear each other coughing at night. In certain spots, the opposing trenches are barely 10 yards apart. Snipers make life miserable, picking off anyone careless enough to raise their head. One popular tactic is to place a decoy helmet on a stick and see how quickly it gets shot. The record? Less than 3 seconds. This close-quarters environment leads to some strange encounters. During lulls in the fighting, soldiers occasionally shout insults or jokes across no man's land. One day, a group of Australians throws tins of bully beef into the Ottoman trench. Moments later, a bundle of Turkish cigarettes sails back in return. This impromptu barter system becomes so common that officers have to issue orders forbidding unauthorized trade with the enemy. And then there are the animals. Gallipoli is swarming with rats, seagulls, and the infamous flies. The flies are relentless. They cover every surface, including food, wounds, and even sleeping soldiers. At one point, an Australian private writes in his diary, "I inhaled 3 flies today, 2 on purpose, for protein." Historians believe he was joking. Probably. As the weeks grind on, disease becomes an even deadlier enemy than the Ottomans. Dysentery spreads like wildfire. Latrines overflow. Clean drinking water remains a rare luxury. Some men resort to filling empty wine bottles with boiled seawater, hoping it won't kill them faster than the actual bullets. Doctors are horrified, but helpless. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal continues to prove his worth. Time and again, he rallies his troops at critical moments. During one particularly fierce counterattack, when his men begin to falter, he climbs onto a parapet and personally leads the charge. It's an insanely dangerous move, but it works. The Allies are thrown back, and Kemal's legend grows. Interestingly, there's still debate among historians about just how much of the Gallipoli defense was Kemal's doing versus the broader Ottoman command structure. Some argue that his fame was exaggerated later, especially after he became the founding father of modern Turkey. Others insist that without his quick thinking, the campaign would have ended very differently. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. On the Allied side, leadership is far less inspiring. Generals are often far from the front, relying on outdated maps and conflicting reports. Plans are drawn up in comfortable tents, while the men on the beaches swelter and suffer. Officer once sent a crucial message by tying it to a pigeon. The pigeon, either confused or rebellious, flew in the wrong direction and delivered the message straight to Ottoman lines. The Ottomans, amused, allegedly sent back a note reading, "Thanks for the intel." By mid-May, the balance of power is clear. The Ottomans control the high ground, the Allies control tiny strips of beach, and neither side can dislodge the other. Skirmishes erupt daily, but the front lines barely move. For the soldiers, this stalemate is maddening. They endure constant shelling, sniping, and disease, all while wondering if their sacrifices are accomplishing anything. For the Ottomans, however, the stakes are crystal clear. This is their homeland. If they lose Gallipoli, the road to Istanbul lies open, and the empire might collapse entirely. Every trench held, every ridge defended feels like a small victory against impossible odds. By the end of May, Mustafa Kemal's reputation has grown so rapidly that even Allied intelligence reports mention him by name. One British officer writes, "The enemy appears to have a certain colonel who is proving most inconvenient." A master of understatement, to be sure. As summer approaches, the heat intensifies, water shortages worsen, and tempers flare. The Allies prepare for another major push, convinced that this time they'll break through. The Ottomans, fortified and ready, wait with grim determination. Everyone knows the next phase will be decisive, but at Gallipoli, decisive doesn't necessarily mean victorious. It often just means a bigger mess than before. By early June, the Gallipoli campaign has fully devolved into trench warfare, a grim, sweaty parody of the Western Front. Instead of the endless rain and mud of Flanders, Gallipoli offers scorching heat, rocky soil, and clouds of buzzing flies that seem to have unionized into a single winged torment. Soldiers on both sides spend their days hunkered down in narrow, winding trenches, staring across a no-man's land so small you could almost toss a biscuit to the enemy, assuming the biscuit wasn't immediately stolen by flies first. At ANZAC Cove, the Australians and New Zealanders have dug themselves into a labyrinth that looks like it was designed by a very angry mole. Trenches twist and turn up the slopes, connected by sap trenches barely wide enough for one man to squeeze through. Some sections are so close to the Ottoman lines that soldiers can literally hear the enemy whispering at night. An Australian private writes home, "They sound like they're just having a chat, probably about how best to kill us in the morning." The summer heat turns this cramped battlefield into a misery factory. Uniforms are soaked in sweat by mid-morning. Food spoils almost instantly, filling the trenches with a sickly stench. And then there are the flies. Oh, the flies! They swarm in biblical numbers, coating every surface, crawling into mouths, noses, and open wounds. Soldiers joke bitterly that if the flies ever learned to fire rifles, the Allies wouldn't stand a chance. One account describes a man falling asleep and waking up to find his face completely black with flies, like a living, breathing mask of despair. Clean water is another constant struggle. Most of it has to be shipped in from Egypt, which means shortages are common. When water does arrive, it's often lukewarm, gritty, and tastes faintly of rust and camel. Men ration it carefully, sometimes choosing between drinking and washing. Spoiler alert, drinking usually wins. The result is an army of unwashed, foul-smelling soldiers who could probably scare off enemies just by standing downwind. Here's a historical fact to put things in perspective. By midsummer 1915, disease was killing more Allied soldiers at Gallipoli than enemy bullets. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera swept through the ranks like invisible artillery. In some units, nearly half the men were too sick to fight. Medical facilities, already overwhelmed, devolved into scenes of horror. Makeshift hospitals overflowed, with wounded men lying shoulder to shoulder on the ground, begging for water or morphine. One doctor later wrote, "We had no beds, no proper instruments, and no hope of keeping anything sterile. The smell alone was enough to make strong men faint. Despite their best efforts, the medics were fighting a losing battle against both disease and bureaucracy. Supplies that were desperately needed, antiseptics, bandages, basic medicines, were stuck on ships or lost somewhere in the tangled supply chain. And yet, amidst all this misery, moments of strange humor persisted. Soldiers developed a grim kind of comedy to keep themselves sane. One ANZAC dugout became famous for hosting impromptu variety shows, complete with songs, jokes, and terrible amateur poetry. The stage was nothing more than a plank balanced on sandbags, and the audience consisted of exhausted, dirty men clutching rifles. Laughter was rare, but when it came, it was almost a weapon against despair. One bizarre trivia nugget. During one of these performances, a soldier dressed as a ballerina and danced awkwardly to the cheers of his comrades. In the middle of his routine, an Ottoman shell landed nearby, showering the trench with dirt. Without missing a beat, the ballerina took a bow and shouted, "Thank you! Thank you! That's my encore!" Apparently, even war couldn't kill good comedic timing. Meanwhile, both sides were constantly trying to break the stalemate with small raids and night attacks. These were usually disastrous. In the pitch-black darkness, soldiers would stumble over rocks, trip over their own barbed wire, and occasionally attack the wrong trench entirely. The confusion was so bad that one British officer allegedly complained, "We've done more damage to ourselves than the Turks have managed all week." One account tells of a group of Ottoman soldiers sneaking up on an ANZAC trench, only to realize they'd gotten turned around and ended up behind their own lines. Rather than admit their mistake, they reportedly claimed it had been a successful reconnaissance mission. Historians suspect this might have been pure face-saving nonsense, but it's the kind of story Gallipoli produced in spades. As the summer dragged on, the stalemate became psychological as well as physical. The constant noise of shelling and rifle fire wore down even the toughest veterans. Sleep was a rare luxury. Men developed a twitchy, hollow-eyed look that became known as Gallipoli stare. Letters home grew increasingly bleak. One New Zealander wrote simply, "We live like rats and die like men." But there were also surreal moments of humanity between enemies. During brief ceasefires to collect the dead, soldiers would emerge from their trenches and mingle cautiously in no man's land. They shared cigarettes, swapped food, and even posed for photographs together. For a few hours, the illusion of civilization returned, before both sides returned to their trenches and resumed trying to kill each other. One of the most famous of these ceasefires occurred on May 24th, after the bodies of thousands of dead Ottomans lay rotting in the sun between the lines. The stench had become unbearable. For 9 hours, fighting stopped while burial teams worked side by side. An Australian officer later described shaking hands with an Ottoman counterpart and thinking, "In another hour, we'll be trying to blow each other to bits again." It was a rare, haunting moment of mutual recognition amid the madness. As July wore on, Allied command began planning a new offensive. The idea was to break the deadlock with a massive assault, supported by fresh troops and artillery. The plan called for simultaneous attacks at multiple points, with the goal of seizing key ridges and finally pushing inland. On paper, it looked promising. In reality, it was about to become yet another chapter in Gallipoli's saga of mismanagement. Historians still argue over whether this midsummer offensive had any real chance of success. Some contend that the Allies were simply throwing good men after bad, repeating the same mistakes on a larger scale. Others suggest that with perfect coordination and maybe a bit of divine intervention, the plan might have worked. What everyone agrees on is that the soldiers in the trenches had little faith in their commanders by this point. The Ottomans, for their part, weren't just sitting around waiting to be attacked. Mustafa Kemal anticipated the Allied move and strengthened his defenses accordingly. Trenches were deepened, barbed wire was thickened, and artillery was carefully hidden. The defenders were ready. and more than a little eager to teach the invaders another painful lesson. As August approached, both sides were steeling themselves for a storm. The Allies dreamed of a breakthrough that would turn the tide of the entire campaign. The Ottomans dreamed of crushing the invaders once and for all. Neither side would get exactly what they wanted, but they were about to create one of the most infamous disasters of the entire Gallipoli saga. For the men sweltering in those filthy, buzzing trenches, the coming battle was both a relief and a terror. Anything was better than more waiting. But as they cleaned their rifles and checked their bayonets, many probably had the same thought. Here we go again. Let's see who survives this round. By August, both sides were thoroughly sick of staring at each other across the same blasted ridges. The Allies had been talking for weeks about a big push to finally break the deadlock. And now the time had come to try something bold, or depending on your perspective, something incredibly foolish. In London and Cairo, British planners sketched out a series of daring night raids and surprise attacks designed to shake up the stagnant front. The idea sounded great in theory. Small, highly trained units would sneak behind Ottoman lines under cover of darkness, blow up key positions, and return before anyone knew what happened. You know, like a Victorian-era ninja operation. In practice, not so much. The first problem was that most of these troops weren't elite commandos. They were regular infantrymen who had never attempted anything remotely like a stealth raid. The second problem was the terrain. Gallipoli's landscape was a maze of steep gullies, jagged rocks, and thorny scrub. Navigating it in broad daylight was hard enough. Doing it at night with only moonlight and a vague hand-drawn map was borderline suicidal. The opening raid kicked off just after midnight, with a group of ANZAC soldiers creeping silently through the scrub. At least, that was the plan. In reality, silence went out the window almost immediately. Someone tripped over a tree root, cursed loudly, and set off a domino effect of men tumbling into each other like a collapsing game of human Jenga. The Ottomans, alerted by the noise, opened fire with machine guns and flares. Suddenly, the would-be ninjas were illuminated like actors on a stage, except the audience was armed and very unfriendly. One survivor later summed it up with characteristic Australian bluntness. "We went in quiet as mice and came out like bloody fireworks." The carnage was terrible. Many raiders never made it back. Others crawled home wounded, muttering about how they'd been shot at by their own artillery. Yes, you read that correctly. In the confusion, Allied gunners mistook the raiding party for Ottoman troops and shelled them by accident. It was a disaster on multiple levels, and sadly, not the last of its kind. Here's a verified historical fact. Friendly fire was a serious problem throughout the Gallipoli campaign. With front lines so close and visibility so poor, mistakes were inevitable. At one point, an entire British battalion was nearly wiped out by their own side's naval bombardment because someone misread a map. The map was later discovered to be upside down at the time of the order. Despite the failures, Allied commanders kept trying new raids, hoping that practice would eventually make perfect. Sometimes they scored minor successes, blowing up an ammo dump here, capturing a trench there. More often, though, the results were confusion, casualties, and very little strategic gain. The Ottomans, of course, weren't about to let the Allies have all the fun. They launched their own nighttime counterattacks, many of which were just as chaotic. In one infamous incident, an Ottoman unit charged an ANZAC position under cover of darkness, only to discover they'd gotten turned around in the maze-like terrain and had actually attacked their own rearguard. When dawn broke, the embarrassed survivors reportedly claimed it had been a training exercise. Historians still debate whether anyone actually believed them. As these ridiculous raids piled up, morale on both sides began to fray. Soldiers joked darkly about being killed by Johnny Turk one minute and by their own officers the next. A particularly bitter ANZAC diary entry reads, "We have two enemies here, the Turks and our generals. Hard to say which is worse." In an attempt to boost spirits, some Allied commanders encouraged creative problem solving. This occasionally led to bizarre innovations. For example, one unit constructed a crude periscope rifle, a regular rifle mounted on a stick with a mirror attached so the shooter could aim without exposing himself. The contraption worked surprisingly well, though it also looked like something built in a particularly dangerous school science fair. Another oddity was the use of improvised grenades made from empty tin cans filled with explosives and scrap metal. These jam tin bombs were cheap and effective, but also wildly unpredictable. One soldier described them as, like playing catch with a very angry god. The psychological strain was immense. Nighttime became a realm of constant paranoia. Soldiers on guard duty would jump at every rustle of leaves or distant shout. Sleep deprivation drove some men to hallucinations. There are accounts of sentries firing at shadows, or in one memorable case, at a particularly aggressive goat that had wandered into no man's land. And then there were the smells. Oh, the smells. Dead bodies, rotting food, overflowing latrines, unwashed men, and thousands of horses and mules combined to create an olfactory nightmare. One British soldier wrote, "The stench is so powerful, I believe it could repel an army on its own." Through all this, Mustafa Kemal remained a constant stabilizing force for the Ottomans. Whenever a raid threatened to succeed, he was there, rallying his troops with his trademark mix of cool logic and fiery speeches. His ability to anticipate Allied moves bordered on uncanny. Some Allied officers even began to suspect he had spies within their ranks. Whether this was true or just paranoia remains a matter of debate, but there's no denying that Kemal seemed to always be one step ahead. One strange trivia nugget: during a lull in the fighting, Ottoman troops supposedly captured a gramophone from an abandoned Allied position. They proceeded to play European dance music over the trenches at night, partly to mock the enemy, and partly because, well, who doesn't like a bit of waltz music with their war? The Allies, amused rather than offended, responded by shouting requests. "Play something we can march to," one Australian allegedly yelled. By late July, it was clear to everyone that these raids weren't going to decide the campaign. The front lines remained essentially unchanged despite the nightly chaos. The Allies needed something bigger, a fresh landing, a dramatic new maneuver that could finally outflank the Ottomans. The generals back in Cairo and London started drawing up plans for just that. Their target? Suvla Bay, a stretch of relatively undefended coastline further north. The idea was to land fresh troops there, push inland, and link up with the ANZAC forces. It was bold, ambitious, and, if history is any guide, doomed to spectacular failure. As the soldiers prepared for this next phase, rumors swirled through the trenches. Some believed the new offensive would finally bring victory. Others suspected it was just another suicide mission dressed up with optimistic speeches. One Australian corporal summed it up: "The only thing that changes around here is the direction we're ordered to die in." By early August, the stage was set. The Allies were about to roll the dice one last time, gambling thousands of lives on a plan that looked great on paper. The men sharpened their bayonets, cleaned their rifles, and waited for the order to move. Somewhere in the dark, Mustafa Kemal was waiting too, ready to meet them with fire and fury. The plan for Suvla Bay was supposed to be the grand turning point of the Gallipoli campaign, a fresh start after months of failure. The British High Command envisioned a dramatic, sweeping maneuver. New troops landing on relatively undefended beaches, racing inland to seize key high ground, then linking up with the ANZACs to trap the Ottoman forces in a deadly vice. It was, in theory, the kind of bold stroke that could finally break the stalemate. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it would become one of the most infamous bungles in British military history. The architect of this plan was General Sir Frederick Stopford, a man whose military experience was so dated he still thought cavalry charges were cutting-edge strategy. Stopford was known for his caution, a fine quality in a banker, less so in a commander tasked with leading an amphibious assault. Even his nickname among officers, Old Fred sounded more like a friendly uncle than a dynamic leader. As preparations for the landing progressed, problems started piling up like sandbags. The new troops assigned to the operation were mostly inexperienced volunteers, many of whom had never even seen combat. They were enthusiastic, certainly, but enthusiasm doesn't count for much when you're trying to storm a fortified coastline. Meanwhile, the Allies' maps of the area were laughably inaccurate. Hills were mislabeled, roads that didn't exist were confidently drawn in, and one swamp was optimistically marked as dry ground. A British staff officer later admitted, "We might as well have been navigating by rumor." The operation began on the night of August 6, 1915, with a massive diversionary attack by the ANZACs at a place called Lone Pine. The idea was to draw Ottoman attention away from Suvla Bay. The Australians stormed Ottoman trenches in a brutal, close-quarters battle that lasted for days. It was heroic and horrifying in equal measure. 6 Australians would later receive the Victoria Cross for their actions there, though for many, the recognition came posthumously. As the ANZACs fought tooth and nail at Lone Pine, the Suvla landing began. The initial approach went surprisingly well. Ottoman defenses in the area were light, and the beaches were almost deserted. Incredibly, some British soldiers walked ashore without firing a shot. It seemed, for a brief, shining moment, that victory might actually be possible. And then nothing happened. General Stopford, sitting comfortably aboard his flagship offshore, was convinced that his men needed to rest and reorganize before pushing inland. So, instead of seizing the nearby high ground immediately, as every modern military manual would recommend, he ordered the troops to dig in on the beach and wait. This pause gave the Ottomans exactly what they needed: time. Mustafa Kemal, who seemed to have an almost supernatural sense for Allied blunders, raced to the scene with reinforcements. By the time the British finally started moving inland 2 full days later, the once lightly defended hills were bristling with Ottoman troops and machine guns. Here's a confirmed historical fact. During those critical first 48 hours, the British failed to capture even a single major objective, despite facing minimal initial resistance. Military historians still cite this as a textbook example of how hesitation can doom an operation. The terrain around Suvla didn't help. It was a confusing mix of salt marshes, scrub, and jagged ridges. Soldiers trying to advance inland found themselves bogged down in waist-deep mud or lost in dense underbrush. Some units wandered in circles for hours, following maps that seemed to have been drawn by a drunk cartographer. One particularly bizarre incident involved a group of soldiers who spent an entire night marching toward what they thought was a key objective, only to discover at dawn that they'd been following a line of donkey tracks the whole time. The objective turned out to be an abandoned Ottoman latrine. Their officer reportedly said with remarkable understatement, "Well, at least we found something." As confusion reigned, Mustafa Kemal unleashed a series of counterattacks. His men fought with ferocity, determined to hold the high ground at any cost. The British, lacking clear leadership, stumbled into one ambush after another. Casualties mounted rapidly. Meanwhile, back at ANZAC Cove, the diversionary attacks were turning into full-blown battles. The Australians and New Zealanders pushed toward Chinook Bear, a critical ridge overlooking the entire peninsula. For a brief moment, they actually captured it. An exhausted group of New Zealanders raised their flag and held the position against relentless Ottoman assaults. But without reinforcements, thanks again to Stopford's delays, they were eventually overwhelmed and forced to retreat. One New Zealand officer later wrote bitterly, "We were on top of the world for half a day. Then the world came crashing down on us." By August 10th, the Suvla operation was spiraling into catastrophe. British troops were pinned down on the beaches, Ottoman artillery was raining shells on their positions, and the high ground remained firmly in enemy hands. Mustafa Kemal personally led a counterattack that smashed through the disorganized British lines. His presence on the battlefield was so electrifying that some soldiers swore they could hear him shouting orders over the din of battle. There's still debate debated among historians about whether Kemal's leadership alone turned the tide, or if the British collapse was simply inevitable due to poor planning. Either way, the result was the same. The last real chance for an Allied breakthrough at Gallipoli was gone. Here's a strange bit of trivia. During the chaos at Suvla, a British soldier reportedly tried to signal for help using a mirror to flash Morse code toward a nearby ship. Unfortunately, the crew mistook it for random sunlight reflections and ignored it. Later, when they realized their mistake, one sailor allegedly said, "We thought he was just polishing his buttons." By mid-August, the Suvla beaches had become a grim parody of the original landings. Thousands of men huddled in shallow trenches, swatting flies and waiting for orders that never seemed to come. Supplies piled up uselessly on the shore because no one knew where to send them. The ANZACs, furious at the lack of support, continued to fight doggedly but with dwindling numbers. They had suffered catastrophic casualties during the Chunuk Bair offensive. Many of their units were now shadows of their former selves, reduced to a handful of exhausted survivors. Back in London, news of the failure began to trickle in. Politicians who had once championed the Gallipoli campaign were now scrambling to distance themselves from it. Winston Churchill, the original mastermind of the operation,
would soon be forced to resign in disgrace. On the ground, however, there was no time for politics, only survival. The men at Suvla and Anzac Cove dug deeper, both literally and figuratively, preparing for the inevitable Ottoman counterattacks. Mustafa Kemal, ever vigilant, tightened his grip on the high ground and prepared to crush any further Allied moves. The dream of a quick, decisive victory was dead. What remained was a slow, grinding nightmare of attrition. As one weary British soldier put it, "We came here to win the war. Now we just hope to live long enough to leave." By the time September rolled around, the Gallipoli campaign had lost whatever shreds of optimism it had once possessed. The beaches at Suvla Bay and Anzac Cove had settled into an uneasy, miserable stalemate. The Allies were technically still holding their positions, but holding was a generous term. It was more like squatting in a very unpleasant, very temporary summer camp where everything tried to kill you. The Suvla operation had been intended to break the deadlock, but instead it simply added another set of overstuffed trenches to the peninsula. The high ground remained firmly in Ottoman hands, and with autumn approaching, the weather began to turn against the invaders. Rainstorms pelted the beaches, flooding trenches and turning dugouts into muddy swimming pools. Soldiers spent hours bailing out water with their helmets, usually while cursing whoever had first suggested invading Gallipoli. Ottoman morale, on the other hand, was higher than ever. Mustafa Kemal's leadership during the August battles had elevated him to near legendary status among his troops. His ability to appear at critical moments and rally his men had convinced many soldiers that he was almost superhuman. An Ottoman private later recalled, "When the colonel rode past, even the wounded tried to stand. We believed that as long as he lived, the enemy could never take our land." The Allies, by contrast, were falling apart internally. Commanders argued constantly, sending contradictory orders that confused everyone below them. Supplies arrived late, in the wrong place, or not at all. At one point, a shipment of desperately needed medical equipment was accidentally sent to Egypt. In its place, the front received several crates of musical instruments, because clearly, what a failing army really needs is a brass band. One exasperated medical officer wrote in his diary, "If I hear another bugle, I swear I'll use it as a bedpan." The daily routine for the soldiers was a grim mix of boredom and terror. During the day, snipers made movement above the trenches almost suicidal. At night, artillery barrages shattered any hope of sleep. Rats thrived in the filth, growing so bold they would literally steal food from sleeping men. One Australian reportedly woke up to find a rat dragging his boot away. When he yelled and threw a rock, the laces. Disease was rampant.
Dysentery remained the #1 killer, reducing even the strongest men to dehydrated husks. Lice were everywhere, so numerous that soldiers joked about naming their pet lice and training them to do tricks. An Australian private wrote, "I've got a champion racer on my left shoulder. If he survives the war, I'll enter him in the Melbourne Cup." Dark humor was one of the few things keeping morale afloat. Here's a historical fact to drive home just how bad it was. By late 1915, nearly 1/3 of all Allied casualties at Gallipoli were due to sickness rather than combat. The peninsula wasn't just a battlefield, it was a disease factory. Even in these dire circumstances, absurdity found a way to flourish. One bizarre bit of trivia comes from the British supply chain. In an effort to provide variety in the soldiers' diet, someone in London decided to send large shipments of jam. Unfortunately, the jam arrived without any accompanying bread or biscuits. So for weeks, soldiers were seen eating jam straight out of the tin with their fingers, or in some cases, using bayonets as spoons. The Ottomans faced hardships too, though their motivation to defend their homeland remained a powerful unifying force. Food shortages hit both sides, but Ottoman troops were often better adapted to the local environment. They dug ingenious cisterns to collect rainwater and scrounged supplies from nearby villages. Their trenches, though crude, were cleverly camouflaged and often better positioned than those of the Allies. As the weather worsened, so did the fighting. Heavy rains turned no man's land into a quagmire. In some places, bodies that had lain unburied for months were suddenly uncovered by the floodwaters, creating a horrific, surreal landscape. Soldiers on both sides described the stench as almost unbearable. During one particularly grim night, an Allied patrol stumbled into a flooded ravine and discovered that the water was filled with floating corpses. The horrified men immediately retreated, one of them later writing, "We were wading through death itself." Despite the misery, the Ottoman forces continued launching small-scale attacks to keep the Allies off balance. Mustafa Kemal, now widely recognized as the hero of Gallipoli, personally oversaw many of these operations. His knack for reading the enemy's intentions seemed almost mystical. Allied soldiers began referring to him as the Ghost, convinced that he could be anywhere at any time. On the Allied side, reinforcements trickled in, but never enough to tip the balance. Worse, the newcomers were often green recruits who had no idea what they were walking into. Veterans greeted them with gallows humor. "Welcome to paradise," one grizzled ANZAC supposedly told a fresh-faced arrival. "The flies are free, but the bullets cost extra." By November, the weather turned truly vicious. Freezing winds replaced the summer heat. Sudden storms lashed the beaches. One particularly violent blizzard caught both sides off guard, killing hundreds of men from exposure. Trenches filled with icy water, forcing soldiers to stand for hours in freezing mud. Some units were so badly frostbitten that they were rendered completely combat ineffective. And then there was the infamous Gallipoli blizzard of late November. Snow piled up so quickly that rifles and machine guns were buried under drifts. Soldiers who had been sweltering in 100-degree heat just weeks earlier now shivered uncontrollably, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find. During the chaos, a temporary truce was declared in some sectors, so both sides could dig out their dead. In one surreal scene, Ottoman and Allied soldiers worked side by side with shovels, exchanging grim jokes while knee-deep in snow and mud. By evening, they returned to their respective trenches and resumed trying to kill each other, as though nothing had happened. Historians still debate whether the winter storms were the final straw that convinced Allied commanders to withdraw. Some argue that the decision was already in motion due to the campaign's obvious failure. Others believe that the sudden onset of winter tipped the scales, making it clear that staying would only lead to mass death by exposure. Either way, by December 1915, the writing was on the wall. The Gallipoli campaign had failed. The grand dream of knocking the Ottomans out of the war was dead, buried beneath months of mud, blood, and poor decisions. The only question now was how to get out, without letting the Ottomans turn the retreat into another massacre. Planning an evacuation under enemy fire is one of the most difficult tasks in warfare. If the Ottomans realized what was happening, they could rain artillery on the beaches and annihilate the withdrawing forces. Therefore, secrecy was paramount. Allied commanders devised a clever series of tricks to conceal their intentions. One of the most famous involved self-firing rifles. Soldiers rigged their weapons with cans of water that would slowly drip into other containers, eventually tipping and pulling the trigger. This created the illusion of ongoing gunfire even after the trenches were empty. Another deception involved campfires carefully arranged to burn at different rates, making it seem as though normal activity was continuing. Even the usual nighttime chatter was mimicked by hidden gramophones playing recordings of soldiers talking. It was an elaborate game of smoke and mirrors, and remarkably, it worked. As the final preparations were made, a strange calm settled over the beaches. Soldiers packed quietly, moving only at night. During the day, they went through the motions of routine, fooling Ottoman observers. Many were amazed that after months of chaos, something was finally going according to plan. The stage was set for the most successful operation of the entire campaign, leaving without being caught. By mid-December 1915, the Gallipoli campaign had gone from ambitious offensive to complete strategic retreat. The irony was not lost on the soldiers who had landed in April with dreams of glory. Now, after 9 months of mud, blood, and absurd mistakes, their greatest victory would be to leave quietly without the Ottomans realizing what was happening. The evacuation was carefully choreographed, like a bizarre, deadly magic trick. Every detail had to be perfect. If the Ottomans caught wind of the retreat, they could turn the beaches into slaughterhouses with a single well-aimed artillery barrage. To prevent this, the Allies relied on deception and a fair bit of ingenuity. At ANZAC Cove and Suvla Bay, soldiers packed their gear under cover of darkness. They moved only at night, slipping silently onto waiting boats. During the day, they maintained the illusion of normal operations. Fires were lit, trenches were manned, and patrols went out as usual. Even the bugle calls sounded at their normal times, thanks to gramophones hidden under blankets. The most ingenious ruse of all was the self-firing rifle trick. Soldiers rigged their rifles with weighted cans of water tied to strings. As the water slowly dripped from one can to another, the weight would shift, eventually pulling the trigger. This meant that even after the trenches were empty, random shots would ring out, convincing Ottoman observers that enemy soldiers were still present. One Australian officer later recalled with pride, "When the last boat pulled away, our rifles were still firing. The Turks didn't realize we were gone until the next morning." The Ottomans, for their part, were suspicious but cautious. Mustafa Kemal's scouts reported unusual movements, but without concrete evidence, he hesitated to launch a full assault. This hesitation saved thousands of Allied lives. Here's a confirmed historical fact. The evacuation of Gallipoli was one of the few unqualified successes of the entire campaign. Over 80,000 men, along with tons of equipment and supplies, were withdrawn with minimal casualties. In stark contrast to the disastrous landings, almost everything went smoothly. But that didn't mean it was easy. The men leaving Gallipoli were gaunt, sick, and exhausted. Many had to be carried onto the boats because they were too weak to walk. Frostbite and dysentery were rampant. Some soldiers wept openly as they left, not from sorrow, but from sheer relief. One British private wrote in his diary, "We crept away like ghosts, leaving behind only the dead and the flies." As the Allies slipped away, Ottoman troops cautiously advanced into the empty trenches. What they found was a surreal landscape. Rows of rifles rigged to fire themselves, half-burned campfires still smoldering, and even a few dummies dressed in Allied uniforms, propped up to look like sentries. An Ottoman officer reportedly remarked, "They fought us for months, but in the end, They vanished like smoke. Back in London, news of the evacuation was received with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was a relief that so many lives had been saved. On the other, it was a public admission of failure. Winston Churchill, whose brainchild the Gallipoli campaign had been, faced fierce criticism. His political career was nearly destroyed. Resigning from his post, he would later serve on the Western Front as a battalion commander, a rare case of a politician literally returning to the trenches after his plans went up in flames. For the ANZAC troops, Gallipoli became a defining moment of national identity. In Australia and New Zealand, the campaign was remembered not as a defeat, but as proof of courage and resilience. April 25th, ANZAC Day, would become a national day of remembrance, marked by dawn services and solemn parades. The Ottomans, too, drew pride from their victory. Mustafa Kemal's leadership at Gallipoli elevated him to national hero status. Within a few years, he would lead the fight to establish the Republic of Turkey, eventually becoming known as Atatürk, or Father of the Turks. Gallipoli was his proving ground, and it cemented his place in history. But beneath these national myths lay a sobering reality. The human cost of Gallipoli was staggering. Allied casualties, over 250,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Ottoman casualties, roughly the same, around 250,000. 500,000 lives consumed by a campaign that achieved none of its original objectives. Constantinople remained firmly in Ottoman hands. The Dardanelles Strait stayed closed. The Western Front continued to grind on, as bloody and stagnant as ever. Here's a strange trivia nugget to lighten the gloom. During the final days of the campaign, some Allied soldiers reportedly carved graffiti into the trench walls before leaving. One message found years later read, "Dear Johnny Turk, thanks for the hospitality. Sorry about the mess." Historians still debate whether Gallipoli was doomed from the start or if better leadership might have salvaged it. Some argue that the geography and Ottoman defenses made victory impossible. Others believe that with clearer objectives, accurate maps, and a commander who wasn't lounging on a ship during critical moments, the Allies could have succeeded. What everyone agrees on is that Gallipoli became a cautionary tale. Future amphibious operations, from Normandy to D-Day, would study its failures closely to avoid repeating them. As the last Allied boat slipped away under the winter moonlight, the campaign finally ended. The beaches that had once echoed with gunfire fell silent, save for the wind and the waves. The Gallipoli Peninsula would never forget what happened there. Neither would the nations that fought on its rugged shores. And now, as the story of Gallipoli draws to a close, let's take a breath. The guns have fallen silent. The trenches, once wounded. The crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, gone. Replaced by the soft murmur of the sea. The peninsula rests under a quiet blanket of winter, as if the land itself is finally exhaling after months of relentless struggle. For those who fought here, there was no clean ending. Many carried the scars of Gallipoli for the rest of their lives, both visible and invisible. Families across the world received telegrams that changed their lives forever. Some soldiers never made it home at all, their names etched only on memorials and gravestones. And yet, from this tragedy, strange legacies emerged. The ANZACs found a sense of shared identity, a bond forged in the fires of battle. The Ottomans, under Mustafa Kemal, proved they could stand against the might of empires. Even the British, humiliated though they were, learned hard lessons that would shape future victories. As we leave Gallipoli behind, imagine the beaches as they are today. Quiet. Peaceful. Visited by travelers who walk among the remnants of trenches and read the names on weathered stones. It's hard to believe that this serene place was once a crucible of chaos. No more orders shouted, no more shells screaming through the air. Just the wind, the waves, and the memory of what was. So, close your eyes and let the noise fade away. You're safe now, far from the cliffs and the flies, far from the desperate cries of battle. The story of Gallipoli remains, but tonight, you can rest. Sleep well.